Awesome. I was just trying to get a little bit of filler time, until you finally made it in here. So we really appreciate you coming on, Tracing Justice, and because a lot of my peeps that follow us, they're kind of new to the movement, and I had some messages, and they're like, SG, and they started researching you a little bit, and they're like, wow, this guy kind of knows what's going on. So SG, man, thank you again for joining us. And if you could give us a little small introduction about yourself, tell us, who you are and kind of how you come into the movement, and just kind of like your little backstory.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. It's really interesting. God works in mysterious and wonderful ways. The
Mm-hmm.
last 15, 16 years of my life, I guess it's 16 years now,
Mm-hmm.
I've been sort of walking around with this realization that I made when I was a 19-year-old college student, that the world all around us is not as it seems. When I was 19, I was in college doing a research design project. If you've listened to my stuff before, Josh, you've probably heard this story before.
Mm-hmm.
And I was the class was, I think, a chemistry class of some kind, and we had to demonstrate the effects on cellular health with consumables. And so people were allowed to choose from various nutrition focused things, and they were supposed to write out a hypothetical research report on basically what the literature at that time showed with respect to additives, different ingredients,
Mm-hmm.
things like what's the fake sugar, aspartame, those types of
Yep.
things. And so I chose soft drinks because at the time I was actually really addicted to Pepsi Cola, believe it or not. And
Yeah.
so I was going through and I was conducting my literature review, again, 19-year-old college students, the fall semester, towards the end of the fall semester. And as I was going through all of my different scholarly sources that you had to have, and you had to have so many from a .gov and so many from a .org and things like that. This was back when the internet was sort of burgeoning on the other side of YouTube's explosion. And I came across an article from the NIH website talking about a food additive called HEK 293. And HEK 293 was an additive that was used by Coca-Cola and PepsiCo, as well as Nestle and a couple other large food giants. Kraft Heinz was involved in using HEK 293, and it was produced by a company called Cinemix, Senomyx. Cinemix no longer exists anymore. Interestingly enough, the same year that President Trump was elected, Cinemix was bought wholesale and whole cloth and then dissolved by a Swiss fragrance and perfume giant. So what I find very fascinating then is why that happened to happen in 2017, because way back in 2010, Cinemix was producing HEK 293, which stands for Human Embryonic Kidney 293rd Protein Sequence Derivative. And so what that is essentially a food additive that was being made with the cell linings of aborted fetal kidneys. And it occurred to me as a 19-year-old in college that the only way you could produce enough cell linings of aborted fetal kidneys that were healthy enough at the time of their harvesting to maintain some organic malleability is through an industrial scale abortion complex. And that's when it all hit me. It was Roe Wade. It was the constancy against the approach against children. It was the bent that society had towards this desensitization, which was really hitting it hard between 2007, 8, 9, and 10 with these Call of Duty games and these various very violent video games targeted at adolescent demographics, for lack of a better term. And so it all made sense to me in that moment. Something clicked and my spirit became very upset. And so I went through a bit of a dark night of the soul. I ran down a number of different rabbit holes. I tried at first to get the college to pay attention to me about what I had discovered. I was very nearly expelled. I was dismissed actually from that class because I was told that it was intellectually irresponsible for me to suggest something like that would be going on with regulatory approval, even though it was from a .nih, it was an nih.gov article, and PubMed was at the top of the sheet, but that didn't matter. But so I went on a dark night of the soul after that, where I sort of wanted to learn more. So I tried to understand things like computer hacking. I got into some DDoS stuff that I probably shouldn't have been into at that time. But again, it was sort of the Wild West with HTML giving way to the next code that came up. I think it was Python, if I'm not mistaken. You'll have to forgive my history here. But I got involved in some of that. I started really researching this concept of the Illuminati. I had seen that before, I think actually on some ridiculous late night television show where they were trying to do a disapproval of it. And it may have very well been something adjacent to Adult Swim. I honestly don't remember, but I had heard that name and I thought, well, that seems like an interesting place. If you're going to hide something like this, maybe you hide in plain sight. That led me to the 13 Bloodline Families book of the Illuminati. I forget the author, but it's a phenomenal book for people that want a good dive right in, with 2 feet sort of thing. That led me into trying to learn more about the deep web, which led me into researching the central banking cabal and the central banking mafia, which led me into this concept of adrenochrome, which early on in those days was not very present on any surface level website somewhere. I mean, you had a few blogs that would host it, but the traffic was so low, I think they managed to slip under the radar. And about 2012 or so, about 2 years after my initial awakening experience, I realized that this was going to get really dangerous really fast. That these types of individuals that were out there had control of a great deal of the landscape. They obviously had control of the US government apparatus. You could look at that just from the behavior of the Iraq War into the Obama administration, and then the fact that these types of depravities and things would be going on, right there under the public's nose. So I knew by about 2012, 2013, that the only way for me to continue this fight was to back off the gas pedal a little bit, if you will, and sort of go dark and just kind of poke a stick at it for a while, do as much research as I could about psychology. At the time, my school of study was psychology, so I wanted to understand more about sociopathy and those types of things that could have affected this. I got involved in studying things like counterinsurgency because it's all based on psychological control, narrative perception, the ability to sway population groups with messaging, all those sorts of things. And I elected to attempt to join the U.S. military around about that time, but I was unsuccessful due to an injury. And so I want to highlight for everyone out there that I didn't actually go into the service early on in the days of the Q News Patriot. A lot of people considered me a post-military analyst, and that's not really true. I'm certainly a military enthusiast. I love the great armed forces of the United States, support our troops, and that's me all the way. But I wasn't actually involved in any of that. I didn't have access to like super secret data or those types of things. But I did make a really beautiful friendship out of that process. And that was with a gentleman who passed away, I believe it was early 2023. And he was a mentor to me all throughout the 2010s decade. He was about 10, 12 years my senior. He was one of the members of the recruiting station that I was at. He wasn't the recruiter. I think he was like a staff supervisor or something. He had a couple of stations that he oversaw. After my journey into attempting all of that and doing that was unsuccessful, and I returned home and was back to full civilian status again, he and I reconnected more on a professional basis. But I knew that his MOS at the time was cyberspace analysis of some kind. And I knew that he was heavily involved in trying to understand things like cryptography, code breaking, coded language, those types of things. And so, we ended up having just a really beautiful professional friendship along the way, all through the 2010s. During that period of time, I was sort of like trying to do the Clark Kent Batman thing. I worked throughout the day. At night, I would come in, and if I wasn't spending time with family or friends or a girlfriend that I was hanging out with, and I was on my computer oftentimes till 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. I went on in the late 2010s to have my kiddo, and so that really sharpened my focus in a massive, massive way. And then I sort of just continued in the life that I had been carving out all the way up until 2020. And when 2020 happened, I was a little bit late to this Q party. I was involved with the Q drops as far as researching them and reading them, not really interacting much, but certainly, taking the information in as early as spring of 2018. And my mentor at the time told me, you need to watch this. This is going to be a very interesting thing. And something like this has never happened before. After about 4 or 5 months of the drops, he could tell that this was a serious effort to convey sensitive information to the public. But it wasn't really until 2020 that I got back into a more fully focused mode. I was doing the young dad thing. I was doing the working American thing. And when 2020 happened, we saw the election steal, the COVID pandemic, the build up to all of it. I recognized that this was some of the same behavior, same conduct, same events playing out that had been described in various books that I had read on the Illuminati subject years before. And so I reconnected with my mentor in a really big way in 2020 and 2021. We talked all the time, all the way up until early to mid 2022 when he started getting very busy with family. And about springtime of 2022, as we were sort of navigating this Biden fever that everyone had, no one could. It was like a fever dream where no one could realize and understand that the election had been stolen, that COVID was this massive biological attack against humanity by this insular Luciferian group at the very top, behind the levers of power and finance and in government and various important factions. And so we were having a discussion one afternoon on the phone, and his statement to me was, well, someone's got to tell him. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, we're dealing with a situation right now nationally, I think, where morale is not so hot for the Trump train and the Q train, and understanding that there is a design behind, that there's a method to the madness, right? There's a design behind the chaos. There's an order to the cosmos. And I said, I just really feel like we're falling off the boat with that, because you've got too many people running in all these different directions trying to explain things. And he said to me, well, you're pretty boring and measured. Why don't you try explaining it? And I said, well, I appreciate that very much. And you're right. I sometimes am a little metronomic in my delivery and presentation. It's just sort of the personality that I am. But I will not compromise my little guy. I will not compromise my family with... Right. Going out there at the moment, because at the time, we were dealing with, again, the fallout of all of that. And I had a spinal injury that occurred in 2020, just sort of as a backdrop against all this. I didn't get that reconciled until 2023. So fast forward a little bit, I made the decision to go ahead and do a podcast, but rather it be on video. I wanted to do an audio cast with an avatar. It helped preserve my anonymity to a great degree. A few awesome Anons ended up digging me up anyway early on, and kudos and hats off to them for that. But I try to maintain, my facelessness as much as I can. I do occasionally appear at Patriot events and, come out and meet the public. I'm certainly not afraid to do that, but I would rather it continue in the current format until we have a little bit more progress on the battlefield. And that's just a little bit of a holistic lens about me. I look at the world with sort of an upside down pair of glasses. I have been accused of being the cynic sometimes, and I tell them I'm not the cynic. I'm just trying to understand all the dimensions of what something can or might mean. And that's always been me since I was a young kid. And so I sort of have an unusual lens on things. And when I see the world playing out in front of us right now, and especially like with what happened with you and me on I think it was the 12th of February, 2026, and then what weirdly and strangely happened about 3 or 4 days later, almost at the exact same time in the other direction, it becomes clear to me that there's much, much more going on in the world. And it really is a matter of, do we have the patience to acknowledge that there's a design that might be higher than ours? Do we have the faith to understand and accept that God is not going to abandon, his people and his beautiful creation to some Luciferian insular group of wackos who have drunk themselves on power in the last couple thousand years? But it is difficult sometimes to see that when you're going through the maelstrom. So that's a little bit about me, and it's a little bit about how I came here.
So for the audience that does not know, SG and I were banned from X on the same exact day. It seems like it happened at the same exact time. And the explanation that I got from X was that I had posted a Panda Eyes video 7 months ago, and it got mass reported. And they basically come down and said, if you take this video down, we will let you back on the platform with no issues at all. So I took it down, and there I was back. But it took like 3 or 4 days. And if you remember, there was a huge push on X to get both of our accounts back. Everybody was like, what the hell is going on? It's like, what did these guys do? That was so egregious. From your point of view, kind of tell me what happened, because I was actually getting ready for a show, and I was pulling all my articles and everything, and then all of a sudden it wanted me to verify that I was human, and I was like, that's weird. So I went through the whole thing, and it says your account has been permanently suspended due to infractions of the X whatever. And I was like, I looked over at Tracy, and I was like, I think I've just been banned from X, and I don't know what I've done. And I'd never got a warning before. Nobody's ever given me a strike before or anything like that. So kind of tell me what happened on your end.
Well, it's fascinating. You should describe it that way because it was almost exactly the same. I wasn't preparing for a show. I had just finished making up a little lunch. I was going to sit down and do a marathon research session. And I usually start with the surface and, the scuttlebutt that comes from X and the scuttlebutt that comes from Truth. And then I move over to more leftist leaning sites, right? And so I was going to start with X first. And I went to log in, and it was through my phone, actually. I wasn't able to get in through my phone. I had the same message appear, verify that you're human. And so I did, and it showed me this message, you've been permanently suspended. And so I brought it up on my laptop because I was sitting down to my laptop anyway. And sure enough, everything was suspended. You could tell that it was an algorithmic process that was in process at the time. You could tell that you had access to something, and then if you navigated away and came back, all of a sudden you didn't. The profile was changing dynamically in the moment. So I knew that there was something going on. And the first thing that I thought about was, am I being mapped? MAPPED. Because I was able to access my messages, and then suddenly I wasn't able to. Yeah. Then I was able to look at a follower list. Then I was only able to look at verified followers and no one else. Then I wasn't even able to look at that. They disabled the ability for me to screenshot certain content, but I was able to navigate to the photo storage, I guess under the media tab on the laptop, and I could see about half of it, but the rest of it was all blacked out at the bottom. And so I thought, sort of like on Star Trek, am I being scanned right now? Mm-hmm. Well, it ended up that, like you said, the ban was unexplained. It stayed unexplained for me. I still don't understand why I was taken off or reinstated. The reinstatement just happened suddenly. And so throughout that period of time, in that 72 hours, I thought to myself, well, there's only a couple of possibilities. Either I've really aggravated the machine, which seems weird because I hadn't posted anything extraordinarily graphic or disturbing or anything that I think would press the line over and above what you often find on Q News Patriot. And I do share, some rougher stuff, and I always disclaim it, letting people know, warning, this is going to be graphic. It's going to trouble you to view it. But none of that, had ever really caused a problem. I'm always very diligent not to show children's faces if it's avoidable. It depends on the footage and how I can edit it on my end. Sometimes I don't share it at all. But I hadn't done anything of that flavor around the 12th of February or anywhere near that within the 7 days prior, where that made sense to me. So I put together a statement. I basically put it out and said, look, they do have a contextual scoring algorithm. Maybe I made that algorithm mad. Here's the exact deets on the algorithm for those out there. I'm not confident that X will reinstate me, but maybe they will. And either way, the show must go on. So keep looking for me on these other places. And then about 48 hours after I put out that statement, I had this random reinstatement on X that didn't make any sense at all. And we were reinstated on the same day. And so what I find amazing about that, and I think you were the one to initially broach the connection through direct message and bring up the concept of, were we just put through an OP? Mm-hmm. And I think we absolutely were. I think the takeaway there is where is the general audience on a platform as large as X with respect to the deeper, darker sides of the truth? Because you've got some big platforms out there and some big influencers with big reach that are able to affect a lot of sway, far, far greater than mine could ever hope to affect. And they're along in their journey, but they're not quite to, some of these darker realities that we have to consider in order to properly understand the context of what's happened to the human race and what happened to all of our governments and what's been going on our planet for hundreds and hundreds of years. And I think another component of that may have been to measure the activity level that people would actually go to. In other words, what's the thought action gradient here, where people witness something and then they're spurred or motivated or inspired to actually act upon it. Where are we at with respect to things like perceived injustice amongst peers, or perhaps, information outlets or funnels where people are getting things? How motivated are they to actually continue to engage with those? The whole thing seems weird to me. At this point, I'm still speculating about it, but the timing of it between you and me seems just so very coincidental. And to see some of the rhetoric that came up in the interim on the X platform in response to that from some pretty large profiles and some pretty large platforms that are well known across this broader sort of MAGA alternative media space, I thought that was very, very fascinating to observe.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was observing everything that was going on because I had actually made a new account under Tracing Justice, and we had made a couple of posts, and I really could understand who was with me and then who was not with me. I had some nasty comments saying, from some big Anon saying, "Oh, that guy's a jerk. He's gone." Blah blah blah. And then I had some people that I would have never guessed come to my defense saying, "This is bullcrap," and it was so surreal watching you and I. We went to the trend. We were trending on X for 2 days, trending. Everybody just reposted me and you, get them back, get them back, get them back. And I honestly think that you are right. It was an op. It was an op to measure where the movement stood as far as supporting the other digital soldiers that fall. And because we've all been through this before, I went back through the Hillary purge and everything like that. But it wasn't, when we got booted, it wasn't commonplace for an Anon just to get booted just for no reason, especially you or me. Elon opened up things for us, but I can speculate too all day long, but something occurred and they were measuring the reaction of certain people, and it was just very telling to me about the public's reaction to everything. To be on such a big platform and have Anons trending for 2 days, I mean, that's very telling of where we're at in the society right now on X.
I think that's a phenomenal point to make, and it goes to cohesiveness too, right? As you look at a fighting force, any fighting force, whatever that force is pursuing or wherever they're headed to, they have to be able to blend and meld with one another. They have to sort of fall and flow and pick up the weight where weight falls down at different points. And I think some of that ties back to the spiritual component of this awakening. Someone asked me, it's been over a year ago now, but the question loosely was phrased like this: how could God let this happen? That was basically the paraphrase of it. And I looked at him and I said, how could he not? When you look at where we're at collectively as a civilization, we had to go through something that was very difficult, extremely confusing, and forced us to look at one another as people again, not as a potential threat actor or as someone that's going to set off some trigger trauma that we've been programmed into with MK Ultra and all this other stuff, or someone that's going to bring us harm just because we disagree with their approach on medical interventions or things of this ilk, or their approach to education, right? And so as I look at it, I reflect back on things, and the February 12th event's just sort of a microcosmic slice of all of that. It's very apparent to me that we're undergoing a maturity here as a human race. We're learning that it's not just about me, it is about we, but it also has to be, to a degree, about what is collectively best for us and what's individually best for us, because all of us individually will drive that collective whole. And if we will drive that whole in agreement with God's perfect and holy will for our lives and for this entirety of this planet, I just don't see how we can fail. But until we get our own blinders off towards that goal and come together in that way, then there's no way we can win.
Right. That's exactly right. Go ahead, Seth.
Just to tie that in, it's so funny. I see, I like to lurk a lot on things, and I won't comment a lot most of the time, but I'll just see where people's heads are. Now, people are still so freaked out. And I mean, just think about back in the days of the Cold War when they were teaching kids to hide under their desks, because a nuclear bomb, you were going to be protected by that little metal desk by hiding underneath that desk, right? So I'm like, this whole thing about all of this, there's two sides to it. I mean, I could go into, the biblical side. It's like, if you really trust God and know where you're going to be with Jesus in paradise the second you're dead, then I don't care. Make sure that nuke is like aimed right at me, though. I want to be the first one gone, because then I'm not going to be sitting in a bed like a vegetable suffering. And I honestly don't fear that kind of death. So the other side of it, though, is how many people are worried that the planet would be blown up by nukes. And here's the thing: God already won when Jesus died on the cross. So if that's the case, you think God's going to allow humanity to destroy his planet to that degree. I mean, yes, would we get into a place where, we could do a lot of damage? Absolutely. But you really think, if you believe in the Bible and what it says, that would happen? And it occurred to me, the level of like people like you, SG, and like Josh and Tracy and me and a bunch of our Anon friends who are true Christians and really believe that Jesus died on the cross, rose from the dead, and is seated at the right hand of God in heaven. And, as far above all powers and principalities, that yes, we still see evil. And yes, we still see battles. But here's the thing. Even a defeated army can still cause you problems after you've defeated them, because you still have some rogue people running around causing trouble. So that's where I think we are. And I just think that's the message I try to spread, is that, listen, guys, if we really think God wins, and he already won, by the way, then let's act like it.
Absolutely. So I will say this too. A lot of the people that come to me, they're like, "Who do I follow?" Well, first off, you don't need to be asking who to follow. You need to do your own research. But I said, one piece of advice that I can give you: you've got all these Anons out there that are preaching Q and all this stuff. That's well and great. But if we're not trying to lead souls to the Lord too, and talking about the Lord and witnessing, then I mean, they might be a good source of information. But as far as somebody that I know that I can be in the foxhole with me, I want my fellow Christians in the foxhole with me. And when I went through this whole ban, Tracy was worried to death about it. And I just kept telling her, and Seth knows this, I kept telling her, I'm like, God's got this. I don't know what he's doing right now. I don't pretend to even know what he's doing, but he's doing something. And I have full faith that this is all going to work out in the end. And for 2 days, she was a mess. And she's like, "How can you just be like this, Josh?" And I was like, God's got it. God has got this. And that was my big takeaway from it too, was I think my faith was tested a little bit right there, and I would like to think that I passed that test. And because at the end of the day, nothing happens that God doesn't want it to happen, or it happens and then he uses it for his purposes too. So, but at the end of the day, I'm so glad that we got our accounts back. Let's roll into this disinfo a little bit. The disinfo ops are off the chain right now. Left is right, up is down. Who we thought was a friend, they're not friends anymore. Why do you think all of this has come to this big escalation point at this moment?
It's incredible that you should lead the conversation in that direction, because we are watching like 3 psyops a day at this point from President Trump. It's just, the man is truly an unhinged genius. And I say that understanding the definition of both words. We have the unhingedness, which leads to the brash conclusions, the bombastic rhetoric, which of course inflames emotions and really sort of blunts psychological resistance that's out there amongst the population, whatever population he's speaking to. And the genius of it is he's doing so in such a fashion that's forcing the American people to look at one another again in that same cohesive fashion, right? Who are we really? What do we really want? What does this nation really want? What does God really want for all of us? It's nice to have President Trump, but President Trump won't be a fixture forever. What does that mean on the other side of things? And at the same time, we also have an opponent who we still face, who Seth described a moment ago as the rogue factions of that defeated army that can cause big problems. They can set up insurgency cells. They can run off the battlefield and entrench themselves in the thicket. They can set up strongholds in villages, to keep with these conventional metaphors that I'm sort of using here. And so all of those individuals are watching President Trump as well, and they have no freaking idea what's going on. And that's the best part of it. And that's the main reason I think that we're seeing the psyops. Let's talk about one of these psyops really quick, Josh. Okay. The fact that we're going to erase the entire civilization of Iran. I'm sorry, gentlemen, but come on. President Trump knows that he can't just go in there and vaporize 90 million people. And
Right.
you had a lot of pundits, both from the mainstream and the alt stream, and even some from the Anon community, that basically came out and said, look, that doesn't look good. That's a really rough thing to say. We're not sure what to conclude from that. And that was, in fact, the entire exercise. We're not sure what to conclude from that. And neither is the opponent that we still face, which I would
Yep.
characterize as the intelligentsia community across the entirety of the Middle East, the Gulf states. If we all think that the Gulf states have been in control of their own resources, I've got a Gavin Newsom bridge that I'd like to sell you. That has not been the case in a very long time. The mid 20th century really gave way to the control of major resources in the entirety of the Mideast region to the various factions in the West. And that happened primarily through the British and then the American militaries. We can look at the history from it, World War II onward, the occupation of those old kingdoms across Mesopotamia to include Persia, which gave way to these Western inspired coups, which of course installed puppet governments that later gave way to coups of a different flavor and ilk to sort of set things up on a very perfectly antagonistic top. And that's the way that I would characterize it. And so all of those parties, all of the descended generational factions of those groups of individuals, those organizations, those entities, those classes of people, all of them had no idea what was coming from this statement either. And so what happens? We see President Trump in the 11th hour from that particular statement say, well, never mind. We've got enough to work with, from these initial agreements and proposals. We're going to go through Pakistan to get that done. Meanwhile, we know that there was a string of false flag incidents that were stopped by various authorities across Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Israel in that period of time. That 10-day window, I think, is what that window was from President Trump. And the civilization rhetoric, of course, being within the last 24 hours. And so we saw a lot of enforcement against the very enemy that we're trying to de-entrench from not only that area, but from all areas of the entire planet. We also saw oil futures just absolutely tank, and then they spiked again, and then they tanked again. It's like he's literally beating the hydra that's inside the worldwide oil and gas markets. And those were established and set up through Rockefeller, Rothschild, and the intelligence community, primarily the CIA and its contractors, along with the Pentagon, throughout the 50s and the 60s, and going back as early as the 1930s in Saudi Arabia. So looking at what we've got, from President Trump, and now he's on another commentary just today, I think, about Tucker and Meghan and Candace and Alex Jones and a bunch of others. This is the same guy that told the whole world that Elon Musk was basically, a villain and needed to be ostracized and kept away from everything good and wholesome because of advantage he was trying to take for money. I mean, it's just almost hilarious and farcical, the games that are being played with us mentally, because we know Elon Musk doesn't care about money and has never cared about money, probably since his early days with SpaceX and getting contracts with NASA and the Pentagon. So
Right.
looking at what we have, and of course that led to the Democrats crying foul for the Epstein files, unifying the entire left with the right around a very core and important issue, which is this harm and protection of children. And I don't even think that they realized, those groups of people realized just how unified they became in the several months that followed that particular event. And then it comes to find out, well, President Trump wasn't actually in the files. He was just sort of mentioned because he was one of the classes of people that Epstein would regularly scout throughout his blackmailing operation. So it makes perfect sense that you would have some overlap between that pulpit and the Epstein pulpit without impropriety or wrongdoing going on. And it also is a masterful stroke when we look at what happened between Trump and Elon and their rhetoric, to put distance between the two from a national perspective that allows for the objectivity of truth to set in. In other words, you don't have people ideologically pearl clutching one way or another, not wanting to believe this or that about the other party. It's just the facts, and they are undisputed, to sort of go with that Tom Cruise movie quote. So with all of that, the psychological operations that we're seeing are myriad, and they're on purpose, gents. They have to happen because we do have an unfinished situation here. We've not quite gotten a full resolution. Yes, we know that God Almighty has won this, and that takes us to the outcome, but it's up to us to be the hands that paint the picture between now and then. And we have to catch up to what that will means for us and for the entirety of the planet. And I think President Trump, quite frankly, is playing his part. And his part was not to make everyone happy. His part was to force the death of the central banking mafia forever.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can see it because the petrodollar at some point has to die. It has to die and it has to go away. But I want to ask you a question. So I'm in the camp of that all these social media influencers, they're all in one big club. They play against each other a lot, but at the end of the day, they're all in one big happy family. And I have preached and preached and preached about Alex Jones and his network of people, and I'm like, guys, they are not your friends. They spew about 80 to 90% of truth, but when it comes down to it, and when it comes down to President Trump having to do what he has to do, they're all going to turn against him. And that is exactly what we saw just occur. And what really hit me hard was I didn't want to believe that Tucker Carlson was part of the little group. But when you go and look at his background, it's kind of no surprise at this point. So, in your estimation, can you kind of see that? Or do you think that these people are kind of playing a part still in the disinfo op? Or is Trump really just now ripping the Band-Aid off and finally telling the world these people are not MAGA? They are not for you. They're for foreign influence money, and that's it.
Well, it's interesting. I think that always should be a concern in the present day and time that we live, because we can measure someone by a couple of different things: their consistency over time and how they behave towards just the average layperson when that person comes across them or happens to interact with them. And so I think it's always good to have that sort of questioning attitude in the background. Are we fully allegiant here? Is there a true, genuine representation of what the human being means for us, or wants for us, or wants for the rest of us, and in so doing is providing this service to us? At the same time, I think it's, like you said, it's very important to look into the backgrounds here, and all of the individuals involved in President Trump's announcement today have really fascinating backgrounds that one really has to ask if something happened along the way just because it needed to, in a sort of a blackmail or arm twisting situation, or if things just sort of progressed in an innocent fashion but then became out of hand. And I think that's also true too in at least one case. It's interesting, I try to take my barometer on most things these days, from a couple of different places. One place I take it from is directly from the Q drops, and anytime that someone is mentioned by name or by initial, with an overt reference, that's something we have to look at and be aware of, because I sort of look at Q as that objective arbiter of truth that we were talking about a minute ago, getting to the truth objectively without a bent one way or another. And I think that was the whole purpose of the Q operation, was to teach people, don't look left or right, look in the middle, look underneath, look down below and see what's behind, rather than just what is being presented immediately in front of your eyes. And so in that sense, we know that one of them was mentioned directly, and I have my own opinions about that. Your audience will be well versed enough to know who that is. And then from the others, I think that we look at, the longevity and exposure to that arena, the types of things that they are willing and are not willing to say even now. I think we have to acknowledge that even very large name podcast platforms and sort of pseudo journalistic entities or journalistic entities, if they haven't come to the plate with some major things by now, like Pizzagate, for example, and others, then I think we have to sort of start viewing that with a little bit of skepticism, maybe a little bit of hesitancy. But anytime President Trump puts someone in the spotlight, in my experience, it's only been for two reasons. It's either because they're secretly bad and he wants the world to know that they're secretly bad, or they're secretly good and he needs to establish a dramatic amount of distance between him and those individuals in the minds of the public in order for the next sequence of events to play themselves out. And I'm sort of split with this being such a recent event today. I'm sort of split on which conclusion I want to draw from it just yet. I want to go back and decode the post, actually look at some of the timestamps. I want to look at some of the rhetoric that was used, the words that are in quotations, and see if I can cross-reference those to Q drops that might be relevant, or other component announcements like from Dan Scavino and folks out there, before I draw my conclusion on it. Because we know that in at least one instance with Tucker, Tucker seems to have almost been utilized as a mouthpiece for a very important message a couple of different times. And one of those was his interview with President Putin. So, looking at this and seeing how this plays out, I guess I'm reserved on my opinion for the moment, but I want to go back and see where it ties over, because again, President Trump only puts people in the spotlight center stage if they're good and there needs to be some sort of distance proclaimed and created there, or if they're not good and they need to be sort of ostracized and moved out in the minds of the public, in as much as we have this sort of cult identity following. And I want to end this segment talking a little bit about that, because I think that's also a contender here for what may be going on. We as Americans are bathed in ideology all of the time. And I think our ideology turns into idolatry if we're not careful. And so looking at individuals that have a lot of influence, looking at people that have done things we respect and admire, looking at people that have gone the extra mile, so to speak, at least in the visual public space, for we the people, or for the country, or for this or that charity, or this or that disadvantaged group, whatever, it's very easy to go from appreciating them to worshiping them. And there's a fine line there that has to be maintained. And I think it sort of keeps all of us on the playing field of human dignity. We are all remarkable creative forces. We're certainly empowered with the Holy Spirit of the living God. It sustains our literal DNA and how we operate and how we work. God's name is literally written on our DNA when you look at the different acid chains and nucleotide organizations and things like that. But fundamentally, we have to keep in mind that at the end of the day, we are, a creation. We are not the creator. And that's a massive, realization to be able to operate with behaviorally, because it requires a lot of us to change our habits. It requires us to not be so fawning over that particular celebrity or that athlete or that political figure that we really respect a lot. And it's not to say that any of this is disingenuous. I'm not saying that people sort of adopt this opinion because they want to go afoul of something that they know. I'm saying that we oftentimes just find ourselves a little too attached, a little too reliant, a little too dependent. And we need to come back to that thing that we can depend on, which is our own intuition, which is connected to the Holy Spirit of God, which is why we're here, in my opinion. It's to carry out his will. And how are we going to do that if we're focused on Tucker or Meghan or Candace or whoever?
Yeah, that's true. That's very true. And, I tell people all the time, I'll get to you in just a second, Seth.
Go ahead.
I tell people all the time, when you're confused, hit your knees, pray to God for discernment. He will always give you what you need in that time. And so, Seth, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to, it's kind of what you were saying and what SG was saying. But here's the thing is that, the Bible is full of, especially the New Testament, you will know them by their fruits. The problem is when you have a certain general that wrote a certain book with a certain man named Boone called 5GW, and we all know what that means, the 4D chess and all the terminology we use. It's like, I've said this, and Josh, you can verify, I've said this for a long time, that long enough that I've known you, which hasn't been very long, but long enough that I'm like, I don't read too much into anything all of these people say, because I have no clue behind the closed doors what actually is going on. And you just alluded to that, SG, was that I don't know if Tucker's now playing a part. One minute he's tight, he's at the White House, he's hanging, at behind the scenes at the elections, 24. And now all of a sudden here's the thing. What's the best way to disinformation people from one direction to another other than to, I mean, we can call Marjorie Taylor Greene, and a lot of us would look at that and say she's a real traitor. No one ever gets called those names by Donald Trump unless they're really evil. And that's probably true. But do I really know? And I'm not saying, I'm just using her name as an example. I'm not calling out to say one way or the other. What I am saying is 100% people need to listen to what Josh and what you say. I mean, I'm just a little nobody, guy who's a wretched sinner who needs a savior, like pretty much everyone on the planet maybe. But I still look at things, I'm like, I don't really know what's going on. And so I'm just going to step back and absorb it and see how it plays out. But I'm still, like you said, perfect example, SG, what you said, is like, God still calls us to play our part. Even though we know ultimately God won, we are called by Jesus to pick up our cross daily and do our job. And whatever that job is, we've all got our gifts. You do yours, Josh does his, Tracy does hers, I'm doing mine. We still have to do our things, but we need to be careful what we get sucked into. And I think you nailed it with the idolatry. So awesome job on that.
Before we move on to the next question, Texas Girl 71 gifted the shades over on pill.net. So thank you very much for that. And we also had Freedom 76 gifted 5 subscriptions to Tracing Justice. So thank you so much for your support out there. So next point. X is banning bots, finally. Every day, they're getting rid of all these reply bots. They're getting rid of a lot of the junk that's in X right now. And also, you've got Bongino coming out saying he's going after all these influencers. Now you got Dan Scavino saying influencers, death to influencers. But now you've got a lot of these fair weather Anon/patriots showing themselves out the door now on their own. And it's, why is that all of a sudden that you think that this is occurring, that all these Anons out there that have kind of just been with Trump and now they're just kind of just turning their backs on him? Why do you think that's occurring right now? All these black pillars that's going on right now. So
well, it's so fascinating to watch. Again, I think that you have a shaking of the tree happening in real time. I mean, we were told that no entity having significant public influence would remain untouched. It didn't necessarily mean that everyone or everything was bad. It just meant that nothing was going to escape, this sort of like scalp level examination about what's actually going on at the bottom of the hairline. And so, looking at the reach that has been created inside the alternative media space and what I would characterize as the podcaster/influencer space, it is now a media apparatus. It may not be classified in that way. We may not have certain U.S. code and law that applies to it, but we know from an etheric point of view, we know from certainly a theoretical point of view and a pragmatic application of it, the online digital space has been fundamentally transformed, and the internet is now the new mainstream media, if you will, the repository where people go to get their information. And those information funnels, while maximized from a freedom of speech, free will, and information standpoint, I think from the entity called Q, who called themselves the gatekeepers of all, and by all we mean all information. That's a direct quote from the Q boards. We still have to look at the integrity of that information flow as needing to be maintained to a degree until we can all get on board with the same basic truths about what's actually happening in the world. You still have a lot of people out there that will not touch the word adrenochrome. You still have a lot of people out there that will not touch, what actually happened with Baal in Siaga. And I sort of gave the emphasis there at the beginning for the folks paying attention. And certainly not with the darker components of the Epstein revelations, which have rocked even some pretty seasoned patriots, seeing the actual discussions, the actual wording used, the actual verbiage that these people get off on. And so looking at that broad influencer, podcaster, alternative media microphone, if you will, it still has to be checked and balanced along, in many ways, I think, just like the mainstream media does. The mainstream media still has a job to do. It will eventually go to the altar in ashes, but it still has a job to do as it guides the lost sheep that it purposefully turned away over a period of 100 years, sort of back towards the fold where they can latch on to this broader information ecosystem that we've been talking about. All of that has to be salted, if you will, and seasoned in the same exact way because it produces the refined truth. It produces what's actually real about the world. And more than that, it gives people confidence. It really gives them back their confidence in where they're getting their information from. If there is not a party on one side to pay the price for disingenuousness, then there is not a party on the other side that benefits from that price being paid and thus gains trust and restores trust in the viewer and in the observer. And that's how it has to be. We have to collectively go through a period where we witness sources that we're attached to, people that we're familiar with, information that we're accustomed to hearing begin to change, warp, move, shift, die off, resurge, die off again. That entire process is sort of like the circle of life in the information ecosystem, because I think that's the only way that God Almighty can bring us to any sort of actual truth, right? We're baked in so many layers of lies and so many different layers of corruption and infestation and certain components of problematic co-opting at every level of our society that really a spin cycle has been needed, and it has to run a few separate times in order to purge things. And I think that's exactly what we're going through. Plus, it makes sense. Why wouldn't you want to get rid of bots? Why wouldn't you want to get rid of things that are influencing that perception in an antagonistic fashion that's not real? If you are a patriotic movement at the highest levels of planetary systems and levers of control, and your design is to try and free the population from mental slavery and restore their confidence and ensure that their perception of reality aligns with what reality actually is under God and under all creation, then you have to get rid of the artificials. And the artificials are the bots. They're the bot farms. They're the Chinese software. They're the things you can buy off Alibaba if you're good with a couple of VPNs. And they don't help anything except some sort of baseline that eventually warps balance sheets. But those balance sheets always end up corrected in the end. So what's the point? So I guess all of it from where I come from with that, Josh, is to say, if people are losing followers, that's fantastic. I probably will lose a couple thousand followers, and that'll take me right back down to about 117. And what a great number that is, because at the end of the day, it's all about true authenticity. It's about understanding what the real message is, the sources that are at least making an honest attempt to bring truth to the masses. And I think that's really the bar here, right? This is not a gigantic limbo bar that's all the way down on the ground. This is a pretty easy bar to go over or go under, however you want to picture it. Just be honest and be forthright if you make a mistake, and try to help people understand what you believe to be the truth of our world. That's really about it. Everything else is about spiritual maturation, and I think we're getting that lesson anyway.
Absolutely. And I believe right now that God is separating the wheat from the chaff right now. And he's doing it in multiple ways right now. He's bringing dark to light right now. The best disinfectant is sunlight. And you're bringing all of this sunlight onto all of these influencers and all of these podcasters, and they're having to make a choice right now. Are they going to listen to their handlers, or are they going to do the right thing and be for this country? And I believe that's what you're seeing playing out right now. So I did want to ask you this, because there's this growing like sediment that has exploded onto the scene in our movement. I am not one of these people that think that everything is hugely scripted out and everything you see is completely fake. I am not in that camp. I believe that Q said the war is real, the news is fake, but I think we lost SG.
Yeah, it looks like he.
Maybe he didn't like my question. No, he's. I think he was on his phone. So let's just wait for him to come back real quick. And what SG was talking about earlier was this Donald Trump post. Let's see here. Here he goes. He's back here. Are you back with us?
Sorry about that. Technical difficulties on this end. Please continue.
That's okay. So I don't know what the last thing you heard me say was, but I am not in this camp that everything is been completely scripted out and we're just watching everything unfold. I believe there are some aspects of it that are planned out. I do think that there are some people out there that are fake, but not everybody is a wearing a mask, and there are some people. Joe Biden. I mean, who can deny that? But anyways, so what is your take? What is your take on all of this new push that it kind of started in 2021 that everything's just a big show. You can sit back, you don't have to do nothing, just kind of absorb it all, and it's just for the normies. Because I think that makes people complacent.
Well, it's very interesting that you should ask this question, because I think this conceptual divide lies at a lot of the core confusion, I think, that sometimes comes up on the right about some of these finer issues. Are we a corporation?
Mhm.
Are we this? Are we that? Et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
I think ultimately what you've got with respect to the movie, not a movie situation is exactly as you described. And we were not told anything differently by the entity called Q. We were never told everything is going to be a movie and you don't have to do anything at all. As a matter of fact, the message from the Q entity was almost totally opposite of that.
Mhm.
We have them by the throat. You have to do your part now.
Yep.
And so looking at that particular constellation, that difference of interpretation, I think we have to start with the same basis here. We were always told that some of this will be as of the result of a submission deal, a plea deal privately that was entered into that likely won't be unsealed. Like, we were told that sometimes that is what's happening. And so in that sense, you do have some scripting. We were also told that timelines are not always exact, that things happen dynamically, that things have to be event driven, that we lose windows and gain windows based on the response from the population at large. In other words, we were told that this is a symbiotic process and that there is no exact coordination, if you will, that is pre-planned years and years out, except for certain punctuation events, which became controlled at very high levels, such as the death of the English Queen and the montage of the new king's portrait, which is just an inverted upside down Satan. And so when you look at the constellation of how things are happening in the world, that's very much how it feels, right? We're sort of seeing certain things that happen, and we can say, yeah, we kind of predicted that would happen. That makes a lot of sense, that something like that probably already would have been done. Good example of this being the delegation from Taiwan that just went to Beijing like a couple of weeks ago. It's not even been that long ago, to talk about reunification peacefully. I think we can say some of that may have been already done, and now we're just sort of ironing out some documents, crossing some T's, etc. Other things like the dynamic situation that's happening in the Middle East with respect to not one but three separate enemies that I can make that have reverse infiltration inside of our system: the Iranian side, the Israeli side, and the Egyptian side. All of that has to be dealt with as it comes, right? Those are dynamic, organic events, many of them. And we also know that some of it isn't. President Trump's told us there's central casting involved in at least a couple of instances, which tells us that was a foregone conclusion anyway. But we have to remember the enemy that we're fighting and how we have to drag them out. And we can't just tell the whole world it's all Satanists, because then you'll end up turning, even to this day, you'll end up turning too many people away because they'll find it too unpalatable and they'll throw their head in the sand. So I think what you have is a hybrid of what a lot of people's, sort of left brain, right brain interpretations of all of this have been over the last several years. Of course, you have some scripting events. Look at the fact that Joe Biden isn't even real. Look at the fact that we had a new Netanyahu shortly after Iran claimed that they blew the guy up in a bunker. And you could tell the mask was a different skin tone, gentlemen. It wasn't even a great mask. It was on purpose.
Right.
When you look at some of that, you can say, okay, some of this is being controlled at a very high level for a particular predetermined outcome. But when you look at some of the videography that comes out of Iran, when you look at some of the videography that comes out of Ukraine and Russia, when you look at the activities of NATO in response to what Russia has been doing in Ukraine, a lot of that still requires some in the moment handling. And so, in other words, this movie that we're all, living through, it's no different than the reality that we've always lived through, except now we have forces that are for it's almost finally, if you will, working in the interests of we the people rather than against them. This is the time that we should be more involved, if anything, because for those of us that were active in a past life, for those of us that were involved in civic responsibility or academia or instruction or waking people up of some kind or trying to help out our communities in a past life, we were never able to really do that because so much of the deck was stacked against us after you got to a certain glass ceiling. That is just not true anymore. You can take this, whatever that cause is, whatever that meaningful purpose is for you, whatever that calling that you feel the Lord has put on your heart, and you can run that all of the way to the gate and just watch the expansion happen in real time, because for once we have the scales more balanced here. So I hope I'm not getting too preachy with respect to the answer to that question. It's just a question that kind of gripes me. I can't see how, and have never been able to truly understand how, we could have so many phenomenal Anons who followed along and kept themselves engaged and went down the rabbit holes and the trails, simultaneously thinking that nothing more than keyboard warrioring is required of them. The U.S. military goes out there oftentimes in operations that are never brought to light, never discussed, never told about, and for which medals are never given publicly. And they literally save the human race at different points along the way. One such incident happened on a Russian boomer submarine in the 60s, I believe, when the captain made the decision at that time, this was a Russian captain, made the decision at that time that it was not worth following the protocol because the protocol would result in the end of civilization. And that story wasn't told for 50 years because it was classified in the USSR's archives and wasn't released until like 2010 or 11 or 12, long after everyone involved in the incident had passed. And so if those types of things are going on every day, I think we can at least acknowledge that from where we sit civically, from where we sit in our civilian life, we should do what we can and what we feel we are called to do to participate in this system that we all have, because if we don't, it will get taken away from us.
That's right. That's exactly right. Go ahead, Seth.
Well, one quick question for you, because I know your time is short. You've got some kiddos to attend to, which is awesome. I love good fathers. But I asked Josh if he had any ideas about this with you. He said, dude, ask him. I was like, okay. You did mention the bloodlines, and I know that you're very well rounded in all of the history of all this. So there are so many people that are screaming one way or the other way, and Iran is this, and Israel is that, and Venezuela, and blah blah blah. And of course, we know Susan Kokinda and her team, which do a great job. Talk about the City of London. Well, I know. We all know that it comes back to very specific, trillionaire families, not even billionaire. They don't even advertise those on the Forbes 100. So what are your thoughts on like what's really behind, the parasite or the hydra, if you will, which is the City of London and Switzerland, where, a lot of these, if you will, Luciferian and high level Masons and bloodlines are from. And, just quickly, how does it tie together so that Israel's a proxy, Iran's a proxy, Venezuela was, of course, a proxy, and there's obviously they were using the United States as a proxy to siphon, all of the taxpayer money to go out and do all these things, so they didn't have to spend their trillions. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's a phenomenal question about, where's our focus? Are we expanded to the full picture, or are we only looking at the left corner or the right corner? I think if we're talking about things with respect to nation state capacity, we're still not fully aware of just how the geopolitics of this world and this realm actually work. We need to look at those, what I would call supranational bodies, the IMF, the World Bank, the World Health Alliance, or organization, the World Food Alliance, all these different programs. I think it's the World Food Program or World Food Bank or something like that. All the international court systems, the UN, and all of their various NGOs, Council on Foreign Relations, the Club of Rome, the Council of 300, a number of different societies that are sort of, secret brotherhoods of a religious right that tie into the fraternities that a lot of these supranational clubs draw from out of Ivy League academia in the US, like Yale, for example, or Harvard or others. So all of this sort of to cast the picture for the audience out there that if we're looking at Israel's the problem, or Iran's the problem, or Egypt is the problem, or the problem is the French intelligence service, or the problem is the Italian government, or the problem is some South American cartel, all of those problems have the same problem, which is that they are part of the central banks. They are captured by an intelligentsia community that is both agency and above, does not serve any particular chain of command inside the U.S. government or any other government, serves those types of groups usually meet at the behest of those councils, like the Bilderberg group oftentimes gives marching orders to that level of influence. There is a hierarchy to this, but it's not through politics. It's not through law and order and the system of legalities that we're taught that we have. It is through primarily religion and faith. And if you can have religion and faith in the one true God, you have to acknowledge that there is a great serpent, that there is an antithesis to the one true God. And you have to also keep in mind the possibility that if you worship and serve the one true God, there may be some wackos out there that worship and serve that great serpent. And that's actually true. And that's the group of individual, the class of individual who is the actual problem here in the world. And when we start getting into the banking families, you talked about the Illuminati bloodline families earlier. You know, there's some names that people will recognize, like Astor or Bush or Clinton, or, you know, Medici, I think, is one of them. Rothschild, certainly, Rockefeller, Carnegie, whatever. But I think that there's others that people don't often realize, like Breakspear and Farnese and I think it's Colonna family out of the Neapolitan royalty, if I'm not mistaken. The Breakspear bloodline, if I didn't already mention that. The DuPonts, which were a bloodline tied back to Marie Antoinette. You know, looking at all of who actually is in charge of things, that group of individuals primarily hails from ruling classes of Central and Western Europe, taken from Southeastern Europe over a period of about 1,000 years. And in that period of time, there was infiltration through marriage, through intermarriage, as well as through business partnerships with these what we'll call these Luciferian occultists, who had a practice that is most closely representative of the child sacrifice practices of the ancient god Moloch or the ancient god Baal. People can go back and look that up for themselves to kind of get an idea of where the concept comes from. And these demonic entities, you know, children were literally being burned at the stake in ancient Canaan alive to pay homage to these, you know, pagan gods. And so the belief system is tied most closely to that. You had infiltration into the Vatican, again, over the last 1,000 years. You had infiltration into major financial pulpits and royal families across the various empires that emerged across Central and Western Europe between the year basically 1150 and the 19th century, with the British Empire becoming such a far-reaching force in the world. And so all of that infiltration over generations produced offspring that stayed in the family business and operated in the same way. You could make the case that some of that offspring and some of those bloodlines are themselves tainted with hybridized bloodlines from demons going all the way back to the Nephilim. And I know that that sounds absolutely ludicrous to people when I start getting into that. They start checking out and go, oh my gosh, he thinks demons have crossbred with humans. I understand how crazy that sounds, but when WikiLeaks released their trove of emails in the 2010s, one of the emails that they were in possession of was correspondence between the CIA and the State Department with respect to, and I'm quoting here, the tomb of Gilgamesh and the locations of the buried Nephilim. Nephilim spelled Nephilim. It's a reference to the Old Testament fallen sons of God that bred with the daughters of man. And this is in the book of Genesis. And so if they believed it was real enough to start the Iraq war over it and to go in and actually see if they could locate advanced technology, preserved DNA from a hybridized line, all these sorts of things, I think we have to ask ourselves, you know, at what point is the politics almost irrelevant? At what point do we begin to have the real discussion about, well, which bloodlines are in charge of which areas of the world? How have they done that? And who still remains as a problem? We know that the Rothschild bloodline has clearly been interdicted by some sort of patriotic, humanity interested influence or party or entity over the last 7 or 8 years or so, because we've seen a fragmenting of their entire global construct and the selling off of their empire piece by piece. And so looking at that dismantling, that can't be happening if they were still in control. So the question then becomes who is still in control in certain areas that could be problematic. The Middle East is certainly a candidate for that, in my opinion. The Iranian landscape, ever since the late 19th century, has been under the control of a secret shadow council that involved at first representatives from England, representatives from Iran, and representatives from the Americas, but also evolved over time to include representatives of the Israeli Mossad, representatives of the CIA, representatives of the central bankers, including billionaire hedge fund managers that have been there. And so this secret council, it's approximately 22 members. Estimates vary. It's 19 to 22 is the general range that's concluded, has been in control of the actual geopolitics on the ground since the early 1950s, right before the 1953 coup. So looking at what we have in the present day and time, when we say, oh, Iran is the problem, that belies a little bit of short-sightedness on the matter. The influence inside of Iran that captured Persia is the problem. The influence inside of Tel Aviv that captured the entire Likud government and most of the Israeli Defense Force, and then expounded that capture in extremely evil ways inside that government's own apparatus. That's the problem, not the Jewish people or the state of Israel itself. The state of Israel is just is a nation state. It's who's running the state, who's in control of the state. You know, the United States, up until President Trump, was in control of some pretty bad Kabbalists. And we did some pretty horrible things with those bad Kabbalists in control. But the problem was never the American people. It was the influences and shadow control structure inside of the American government. And so that is the lens that you have to see everything with. You have to look at Russia as split. You have to look at China as split. You have to look at every single major financial power across the West as potentially being split, if not almost certainly split. You have to look at what's going on inside of the Koreas and see the rhetoric about potential reunification to see how that split is maybe beginning to reconcile itself and force itself out. In other words, how the cleanup may be happening in real time. And that's just one example, right? I know this is another long answer to the question. I have a tendency to do this sometimes, but the context is just so very important. If you don't look at things from the lens of faith, religion, and blood, then you're not actually looking at the true nature of this reality. They spent hundreds of trillions of dollars of wealth that they've hoarded from mankind since time immemorial, at least over the last 1,000+ years, to try and convince us that spirituality isn't real. And that's just not true. We are living beings with an animated spirit of the living God. We have a spirit of power. Power means you do stuff with that. You don't have a powerful car and then leave it in the garage. You take it out and you show what it's capable of. You know, we have a spirit like that. We have a sound mind. That's to give us that clarity to move with that power purposefully and in alignment again with that will. And so if they're willing to try and convince us that spirituality isn't real, and they're willing to part ways with the only resource on this earth that they give, 2 cents about at any given point along the spectrum in order to do that, I think we have to acknowledge that what's actually real is what they're hiding from us, and that's how they've managed to stay in control. Satan's greatest deception was convincing the entire planet that he didn't exist.
That's it.
Bingo.
That's it right there in a nutshell.
One quick, tiny little thing to distort. And this is, you just said about the Iran proxy and the 22. Think of this. Daniel, when the angel came to explain to him his dream, and he said, well, I'm sorry I'm a little late. Only a couple weeks, though, because the Prince of Persia, I had to actually sit there and fight him for a while. And then Michael had to come help me. And so now I'm here. What do we got? I mean, come on. I mean, this has been a spiritual war. And you said Moloch and the children being sacrificed in bronze statues. I mean, literally burned alive, where they had to play drums so loud that the Israelites couldn't hear the screams. I mean, this stuff, and this is why Josh and I and Tracy try to preach, like, if you don't know what's in the Bible, you're going to be lost, because the Q operation's only going to take you so far an event, and then soon enough, you said it, SG, if these people aren't ready for the Satanism, you're going to lose them. So they're going to stick their head in the sand. This is the whole reason why I asked that question, because it goes so much deeper than just geopolitics.
Absolutely. Right? Well, my friend, thank you so much for coming on. I know that you've got to run. It has been a complete honor having you on Tracing Justice and giving some insight. If you could quickly tell everybody what's the best place to find you, kind of plug yourself a little bit so my audience will become your audience too.
Well, I appreciate that. And it's been a great conversation, gentlemen. I appreciate you taking the time and having me on. I can be found online in 4 places. I'm on Rumble primarily, and that's the address rumble.com/user/Q News Patriot. I'm not on Rumble by the name SG Anon. I am on Truth Social by the name SG Anon with a red check mark. The handle is real, REAL, SG Anon with a red check mark. I'm on X at the handle THEQ News Patriot with a blue check mark and a username of SG Anon. And I can be found on Telegram at the address t.me/real, REAL, Q News Patriot. It's been a real privilege, gentlemen. I appreciate you again taking the time and having me on. It's a team effort, but we're all going to get there.
We will. And thank you. I appreciate you.
Thank you, SG. It was great to be on with you, my friend.